Howdy folks, I'm Ben Starr, the Ultimate Food Geek. Welcome back to my messy kitchen. And today I am super excited to talk to you about my very, very favorite ingredient, the most important ingredient in my kitchen, buttermilk. Now, in many of my previous videos that involved buttermilk, I have said this and I maintain it to this day. If you don't have buttermilk in your refrigerator right now, I hate you. Fix this problem. Stop this video, go to the grocery store right now and buy 2 quarts of buttermilk to put in your fridge. Now, when I gripe at friends and family for not keeping buttermilk in their fridge, they always tell me, well, I bought it for one recipe and then I didn't use it, and the next time I needed it, it was past the expiration date. Expiration dates on fermented dairy are bullshit, folks. The FDA requires that manufacturers put it on their packaging, but it is meaningless. Fermented dairy products, cultured dairy products, yogurt, sour cream, buttermilk, they are already spoiled when you buy them. They are spoiled with selected strains of lactobacillus and other types of bacteria that have fully cultured or colonized this product. And just like with sourdough starter, a healthy colony of bacteria resists invasion from other bad players like molds and spoilage bacteria. So, buttermilk is already spoiled. If you have some in your fridge from a couple of months ago, open it, sniff it. It should smell a little bit sour, because it is intentionally spoiled that way, but you shouldn't see any mold. If you see any mold, go ahead and throw it away. It's a goner. But as long as it doesn't have mold growing on it, that buttermilk that's been in your fridge for weeks and weeks and weeks past the expiration date is perfectly good to go. Now, the nice thing about buttermilk is you only have to buy it once in your entire lifetime, just like a sourdough starter. As long as you keep renewing your buttermilk, you never have to go buy more. And renewing it is literally easier than my simple sourdough bread baking methods. What we've got here is, there's maybe a half a cup of buttermilk left in this container of regular low-fat cultured buttermilk from the grocery store. And I'm going to take this really nice organic grass-fed milk. I'm going to pour it into the buttermilk container almost all the way to the top. Now I'm going to close the container and shake it wildly. Really want to make sure we incorporate all of that buttermilk that was left over, which contains those bacterial colonies. Want to get it good and distributed throughout the new milk. Now, you do not have to use super high quality milk. Any milk will do, from skim milk with practically 0% fat all the way up to whole milk. But the nice thing about this technique is that it is literally impossible to find like a grass-fed organic buttermilk. And when you do find it, you're going to pay like 10 or 15 bucks for it, which is ridiculous. But you can get these guys for 5 or 6 bucks at the grocery store. Super high quality grass-fed milk. Flavorful, rich, healthy for you. Use that to inoculate and renew your buttermilk. Now this is just going to sit here on the countertop until it thickens. Now depending on the temperature in that kitchen, that can take anywhere from 24 hours to maybe 3 or up to 4 days. No problem. Ignore it. It's perfectly fine where it is. Let it sit there until it thickens. Now I want to talk about the 2 primary types of buttermilk you can find in the grocery store. And let's be clear. Cultured buttermilk from the grocery store is not buttermilk. Buttermilk is a thing of a bygone era that happened inside the butter churn after people milked their cows. They let the milk sit overnight in the butter churn. It naturally soured or fermented with the lactobacillus bacteria that were already in existence in the milk. Then the next day, once the cream in that milk had risen to the top, they would churn the butter, and the liquid left was buttermilk. It's basically skim milk with most of the fat turned into butter and taken out, with a few flecks of butter left in the matrix. That's old-fashioned buttermilk, and even though there are a couple of buttermilk artisans manufacturing true old-fashioned buttermilk in the US, it's really hard to find and it's really expensive. So unless you happen to know somebody that has their own cows and they separate their cream and turn that cream into butter, you're not ever going to have access to real old-fashioned buttermilk, which is perfectly fine because our cultured buttermilk is a fabulous product that has an enormous number of uses in the kitchen, which we're going to talk about in a second. But you're going to notice a couple of different types of buttermilk when you go to the grocery store. The most common is plain low-fat cultured buttermilk. This is typically made with 2% low-fat milk. It's nice and healthy, it's bright and creamy and flavorful, and that's good in pretty much any recipe. Now, if I just have to go to the grocery store because I've run out of buttermilk, and I do that all the time. I can't keep up with my own buttermilk production, so I do buy buttermilk pretty frequently. I prefer to get the cultured whole buttermilk Bulgarian style. Now, Bulgarian buttermilk is fermented with yogurt cultures. Low-fat buttermilk is cultured with sour cream cultures. There are two different types of lactobacillus colonies that are used to ferment different types of milk. Yogurt cultures are called thermophilic cultures because they like to ferment at a higher temperature, over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. These are the cultures used to produce yogurt and Bulgarian-style buttermilk. But the cultures that we want to use if we're making buttermilk at home simply by leaving it on the countertop are the traditional non-Bulgarian, low-fat cultured buttermilks. These are called mesophilic cultures, and they like to ferment at room temperature, and they are the same cultures used to produce sour cream. So, if you're going to be renewing your buttermilk over and over and over again, go ahead and buy that low-fat buttermilk. And if you want a richer buttermilk, just renew it with whole-fat milk. But you can renew with any type of milk right on the countertop at room temperature with standard buttermilk. If you're just buying buttermilk straight off the shelf in the store to use in a recipe, I go for the Bulgarian because it's a little bit richer. However, if you try to ferment regular milk with the Bulgarian buttermilk at room temperature, it produces a very unusual product that's almost similar to a cream cheese. It pours out in a thick, long, gloopy tube, like the thickest Elmer's glue you've ever seen in the world. So I don't recommend buying this if this is what you're going to use to perpetuate and renew your buttermilk. Definitely go with the traditional standard buttermilk. So, why do we need buttermilk in the kitchen? Well, buttermilk's primary tool that most folks are familiar with is as an ingredient in baking, from quick breads or yeast breads to muffins, cupcakes, and regular cakes. Buttermilk contributes not only flavor, but delicacy to a baked dish. This is because the acids that are naturally occurring in buttermilk cut through protein. And when you're making something with flour, when flour gets wet and gets stirred, it begins to develop a protein structure called gluten. Acid snips through that gluten structure, making the overall structure of the baked good a lot more delicate and tender. So, buttermilk is an all-purpose tenderizer for baked goods. Also, it contributes a lot of flavor because buttermilk tastes a lot more flavorful than milk. Now, not all baking recipes call for buttermilk. Many of them call for milk. But the nice trick is you can substitute buttermilk for milk, cup by cup, tablespoon by tablespoon, in virtually any baking recipe, and it will make your recipe better. So if you're making your mom's biscuits recipe and it calls for regular milk, use buttermilk instead. The reverse is not always true, however. If your recipe calls for buttermilk and you try to substitute plain old milk, the recipe is not going to turn out right because that recipe is relying on the acidic quality of the buttermilk to react with usually baking soda, a high alkaline. That produces the carbon dioxide that causes that muffin or quick bread to rise. So if you don't have buttermilk and you're having to substitute milk, you got to switch from baking soda to baking powder or add a tablespoon of vinegar to your cup of milk to make it mimic something sort of like buttermilk. But you know what? That just doesn't really do it. The flavor is not quite there and the texture is not quite there. It's always better to use buttermilk standard. So yes, you can substitute it in any baking recipe you already have. Virtually all the recipes on my website that call for a dairy product use buttermilk in the first place. But an equal substitution of buttermilk for milk will improve virtually any recipe you can find for a baking product. It's also excellent as a substitute for milk or even cream in frozen dairy foods like ice cream. You can use this thick, rich buttermilk instead of heavy cream to make an ice cream that is much lower in saturated fat, but still indulgent and rich in texture. I really do love making buttermilk ice creams. You can substitute any amount of milk or cream for buttermilk or the entire amount that the recipe calls for. Just note that your ice cream is going to have a slightly brighter flavor to it because of that nice acidic twang. But buttermilk doesn't only shine in desserts. For me, it's absolutely crucial for making proteins. I mentioned earlier that the acidity in buttermilk breaks down proteins. That holds true with meats just the same way it holds true with flour and doughs. Buttermilk tenderizes meat. So it's vital as a component of marinades. Now, pretty much everybody knows that good old-fashioned fried chicken is chicken that's been marinated in buttermilk for up to a day or even longer. And yes, my super unbelievable fried chicken recipe involves marinating chicken thighs in a combination of buttermilk, salt, and crystal hot sauce for about 24 hours before breading it and frying it. And it does produce a noticeably more tender meat, as well as contributing a lot of delicious flavor, both to the crust of the fried chicken and to the chicken itself. But you can also use buttermilk to tenderize anything from pork to beef. If you're a hunter and you regularly have access to a lot of those game meats that are delicious but have sort of that livery gamey flavor, buttermilk has this magical quality not only of tenderizing these very, very lean game meats that have almost no fat, it also has this really miraculous method for eliminating that super gamey flavor. So if you regularly work with venison or elk or even game birds like wild duck and quail, soaking in buttermilk for 24 hours can radically improve the flavor of that meat as well as making it more tender. And if you add salt to that equation, it also creates a perfect brine, buttermilk brine, not only for making meats more moist as well as more tender, more delicious, and less gamey. Now, most people don't really think of combining dairy with fish, but buttermilk will do the exact same thing to a piece of fish that's a little bit fishy smelling. Now, proper fresh fish should never have that fishy smell, but for those of us that don't live right on the coast and have access to same-day caught seafood, buttermilk is exquisite. It can remove that funky, fishy flavor from everything from shrimp to cod or tuna. All you got to do is soak that fish fillet in buttermilk for at least an hour in the fridge, up to 4 hours, but not overnight, because the acids in the buttermilk will start breaking down the proteins in the fish and it can turn it mushy. So limit your marinating time for seafood if you're using a buttermilk-based marinade. Pretty much the only thing that buttermilk cannot substitute for milk in is your morning coffee. If you do have buttermilk in your house, chances are somebody in the past has poured buttermilk into their coffee mug when they're nice and sleepy in the morning and then immediately seen it separate into all these weird clotty things and say, "Oh honey, the milk's bad." This coagulating property of buttermilk when it's heated is actually a property that is exploited to make cheese. Cheese making is the process of isolating the fat content in milk into curds and removing it from the water and protein content known as whey. Now, the only way to get this process to happen is to culture or acidify that milk and then heat it. So acidified dairy separates when it's heated into its components, curds and whey. Once this buttermilk thickens up and cultures, I'm going to show you a really neat trick on how you can turn this 2-quart container of buttermilk into a really delicious, creamy homemade cheese. Super cool. But you know me, I'm not going to let you get out of here without a little bit of science. So I'm going to explain to you now why buttermilk is thick if it is nothing more than regular milk with some lactobacillus bacteria in it. Another one of my brilliant illustrations. You're so lucky you get to be able to look at this one. In regular milk, before it is cultured, we have several primary components. These little stars here represent the protein in milk, which is called casein. These yellow dots represent the fat in milk, which is contained in little globules. These little green triangles represent the sugar in milk, also known as lactose. When we introduce lactobacillus bacteria here, they immediately go after that lactose and they eat it and they break it down into lactic acid, the same stuff that builds up in your muscles after a really hard workout and makes your muscles really sore. Now, what happens when lactobacillus meets the milk is all these tiny little bundles of casein proteins, they break apart into all their little respective filaments. But casein really is attracted to each other like a magnet, so then they try to reform each other, but because they don't have their natural structure being bound in that tiny like crystalline structure, they just try to attach to each other any way they can. And as they do, they trap the liquid and the fat in a matrix that is delicate yet somewhat solid. This is the same thing that happens with yogurt and sour cream. The reason sour cream is thicker is because they're thickening cream, not just milk, so there's a much higher fat content. The reason yogurt is thicker is because they use a different strain of bacteria, thermophilic bacteria, that ferment at a higher temperature, and then that yogurt is strained to remove some of the whey. Buttermilk is not strained at all, so the whey is still in it. That's why you get a gently pourable solid structure. It has been 24 hours and You can tell just by shaking this that the liquid inside is a lot thicker than it was when we poured in our fresh milk. I'm going to take a quick peek here. Beautiful, thick, rich buttermilk. And all you had to do was just wait for it to happen. Now, it took about 24 hours for this to culture up perfectly in my kitchen. Now, this process is all dependent on the ambient temperature. It's 75 degrees Fahrenheit or 24 Celsius in my kitchen, and that is really the target temperature for culturing buttermilk in a 24-hour period. If your kitchen is significantly cooler than that, it may take up to 2 days for the buttermilk to thicken. If your kitchen is significantly warmer, this process may happen in 12 or 14, 16 hours. The duration of culture time isn't really that much of a factor to worry about. However, the longer your buttermilk sits after it cultures, the thicker it's going to get, to the point where it can become almost not pourable, almost as thick as yogurt. That's also perfectly fine. Give it a nice hard shake to sort of break it up as if you were using a blender, and that will make it a pourable consistency for you. It's no problem if the buttermilk over thickens as it sits on your countertop. You're just going to notice the flavor will be a little bit more tart or acidic. Now, I mentioned earlier that you can actually turn buttermilk into cheese, and that is because this initial culturing process is the same process that's used to begin the cheese-making process. And there's a laughably simple way to turn your freshly cultured buttermilk, or just a container of buttermilk from the grocery store, into fresh homemade cheese. Super easy. So what you're going to do is pour the full 2 quarts of buttermilk into an oven-safe pot. You can use a Pyrex container or a pot like this. Just make sure it's got a lid. Ideally, you don't want to use foil as a lid because aluminum can be corroded by an acidic substance, and this buttermilk is actually acidic. So, lid goes in the pot. It's going to go into a preheated 375 degree oven, and then we're going to check it at 20 minutes to see if it's curdled. 20 minutes later, and the heat has caused our buttermilk to curdle, or to separate into curds, which are mostly the fat content of the buttermilk, and the whey, which is water and protein left behind. You can see that this happened very clearly. We have the almost solid looking curd right there. When you touch it with a spoon, it looks definitely like a solid. And then there along the outside of the container, you can see that liquidy whey. Our next step is to separate the curds from the whey. And for that, you're going to want to use colander like that, set over a nice heavy bowl, and then you want to line the colander. Now, classically this is done with cheesecloth, but I really don't like using cheesecloth. I find it expensive, very hard to reuse, and I don't really like either of those two things. So what I typically use is just a nice soft flour sack cloth, same kind I use for baking bread. These are invaluable all over the kitchen, and they work beautifully for straining. Other things, if you happen to have somebody in your family that's a brewer, they probably have one of these grain bags. Or if you've got somebody that makes jelly, they have an almost identical tool called a jelly bag. These are fine mesh bags that can be washed and reused many, many, many times, and they are also invaluable in the kitchen for a variety of different reasons. But I am going to use my flour sack towel here, and then gently pour the curds and whey into the container. You'll notice I've got a little bit of whey that didn't have any curd in it. There's no reason to pour that in there, so I'm going to leave that off to the side. And now we need to wait for the whey to strain off of the curds. Now, this whey is a super nutritious, high-protein liquid. Do not throw it away. I like to chill it down, put it in the fridge, and use it as a substitute for water in bread baking. It gives your bread a wonderful, creamy, rich flavor. You can substitute it cup for cup, ounce for ounce in any bread making recipe. You can also add it to smoothies to up your protein content. Worst case scenario, feed it to your pets. But the one thing you should never do with whey is pour it down the drain. Now, after your curds have cooled for 20 or 30 minutes and they're not screaming hot anymore, you want to take the corners of your cheesecloth or your flour sack towel and tie them up so that the entire thing can be hung. The longer it sits in that sieve, the longer it's going to take to actually strain. And we do want this to strain off as quickly as possible. It's still going to take several hours though. Alright, so now we have a perfect little hanging bag, and you'll just have to find the spot in your kitchen that's best. My sink does a really good job because I've got this little arm here where I can hang these without any trouble at all. And you can see there's whey pouring out the bottom of that. So I'm going to let that strain for anywhere from 4 to 6 hours. The longer it drains, the firmer the cheese will be and the tangier the cheese will be because it's continuing to culture as it sits here. But you definitely want to let it drain until there's no more whey dripping out the bottom. And don't forget, empty container, refill it with good quality milk, and tomorrow you'll have buttermilk again. It's been about 2 hours, and as you can see, the whey dripping from the bottom of my curds has slowed to just an occasional drip every 30 seconds or so. If you like a really creamy, soft cheese, sort of like cottage cheese, this is the time to go ahead and pull your curds. But if you're looking for something a little bit drier and richer and tangier, like ricotta, go ahead and leave your cheese to drain for another 2 to 4 hours. Now, if the idea of this cheese sitting out at room temperature for so long bothers you, rest assured, you have a naturally cultured bacterial colony in this cheese that's working hard to protect it from invasion by bad bacteria, the same way that happens in your sourdough starter. The longer it sits at room temperature, the more lactic acid is produced, and the brighter and tartar your fresh cheese will be. Another trick you can use to achieve a drier texture in your cheese is to gather up the bag, twist it, which will extract a significantly larger amount of whey in less time. So if you're after a drier texture, but you don't want a sharper flavor, you can use this technique to pull out extra whey. After the cheese has drained to your liking, pour off the whey to refrigerate it. Now don't be alarmed if it looks a little bit greenish. Now I know we are not accustomed to dairy products being green in color, but this is the natural color of the whey. Again, use this. It is super valuable, especially in bread baking. If you're not going to get around to it within 24, 48, or maximum 72 hours, freeze it because that will keep its quality fresh for you to thaw out and use in the future. But it's golden stuff. Don't get rid of it. Now is the time for you to flavor this fresh cheese, and just make sure your hands are nice and clean. You can add a nice little pinch of sea salt here and then just work it in. And this is also the time to work in any other ingredients you'd like to use to flavor your cheese. I really do love freshly cracked black pepper. I think that's a wonderful flavoring agent for this nice fresh cheese, but you can stir in chives, honey, anything like that. This stage is actually the beginning point for making a variety of hard-aged cheeses, but that's a whole other video series. You gotta have a cheese press and cheese molds and all that kind of good stuff, temperature and humidity controlled aging chambers. But this is a beautiful fresh cheese and you can use it any way that you would use ricotta or cottage cheese or even cream cheese. My favorite thing to do is just smear it on some of my freshly made sourdough bread with a little olive oil, salt, and black pepper. You will die and think that you have gone to heaven. It's so delicious. But you can use it to make cheesecake, you can stuff pastas with it, make lasagna, or just enjoy it by the spoonful. Oh, delicious. I hope this time has really opened your eyes to the wonders of buttermilk. It is not just something to buy once or twice a year when your recipe calls for it. It should be in your kitchen 24/7. I personally could not live without it. I'm Ben Starr, the ultimate food geek. Thanks so much for watching. Hit me up on my website, benstarr.com. Find me on Facebook if you'd like to interact, and subscribe to my YouTube channel for lots more awesome kitchen stuff. Thanks for watching.